Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to remind you that my book, Drummers on Drumming, is available now on Amazon as both a paperback and an ebook. Based on the Big Fat 5 segment of this podcast, where I sit down with my favorite drummers to discuss the 5 records and stories that shaped their approach to the instrument, this book is packed with insights from the drummers who redefined how we think about the modern drum set. You can grab your copy now by checking the link in this episode's show notes or simply searching Drummers on Drumming on Amazon. So thank you for all the support, and now let's get into the show. Hello. Welcome back to Big Fat 5, a podcast financially supported by Big Fat Snare Drum and a member of the Drum Click Podcast Network. My name is Ben Hilsinger, and this week's guest is Jason McGerr. What can I say about Jason? He's the drummer for Cab For Cutie, which is enough right there, but he's one hell of a drum educator, and it seems like everything he says is carefully thought out, and this conversation is no exception. Yes, we get into the top 5 influences that shaped the player he is today, but it's the little pockets of wisdom throughout that make this one of the most fruitful conversations we've had in this podcast. I personally think that. I look up to Jason a whole hell of a lot, and his perspectives on technique, finding your own voice, and ultimately protecting that voice with a vengeance is something we should all subscribe to. I hope you enjoy this chat as much as I did, and if you haven't already, please rate and review. Unless you hate it, then just have a good day. All right, cheers. I actually want to start off with a question from Guy Licata, who's a friend of the show.
I saw that.
He wants to... Yeah, so he wants to know... Well, he's from Reflex Practice Pad now, Zildjian's conditioning pad, so congrats to him. But he wants to know about your practice pad collection and pipe drumming.
Oh, man, that guy. The mad scientist, Guy Licata, who brought us Reflex Practice Pads. Great pads for anyone that hasn't played them, and now very widely available via the Zildjian website. They are the most socially acceptable practice pad I've ever played, not to mention a really great conditioning pad. But I met Guy in New York after seeing Mark Giuliana play at the Blue Note, and Mark had this tiny little Reflex practice pad that was like a prototype, and he's like, "Oh, you got to meet this guy." And I was staying in Brooklyn, and he put us in touch, and I went and met up with Guy, and our relationship was launched, and we found out that we both had this sort of passion and obsession with practice pads, and so we have forever kind of gone back and forth. And matter of fact, recently I sent him a mock-up of a fake practice pad that I took a really nice picture of. I just found this piece of like extra rubber at a hardware store that was like 10 inches around, and I put it on a piece of wood, and I sent him a photo with like no words, just like to freak him out. And he said his heart skipped a beat because he's like, "No, not another pad on the market." Yeah, I mean, the first practice pad I ever had was the HQ Real Feel. You know, I think I inherited it from the Seattle Drum School, and it was so cracked and, you know, weathered that it didn't even play that well, but it was a cool pad. I actually, before that, I think the very first pad I had as a kid was one of those Ludwig tunable, or Remo, with the plastic ring you tour with. I think you tuned it with a Phillips screwdriver, maybe, not a drum key.
And they were just as loud as the real drums.
So horrible. Yeah, and they moved all over the place. I mean, some of them you could put on a stand, but anyway, I threw... We'll get back into this. This segues into practice pads, but I had a really amazing teacher for a long, long time named John Fisher, who lives in Vancouver, BC, and he was a pipe drumming guy, world champion Scottish drummer, and he just basically introduced me to the fact that there's just such a deep world within your hands and your technique, and like so many things to investigate, many different dynamic levels. And he basically got me off of the drum set. Like, he made me want to just give up drum set and just focus on practice pad playing and my hands in general. And this was when I was like, maybe, I guess I was probably mid-20s, and I'd been playing long enough. Was like, all right, I need to investigate more of what's going on with my playing. But I met him, and he had what was called a Hugh Cameron practice pad, which is this pad right here. Really difficult to find. Let me see if I can put it in the light here. They only sell them on Scottish sites, but this pad, there it is. There's his signature, John Fisher. See you soon. Stick with it. You know, classic dad joke there. Jim Kilpatrick, who was another world champion. And then one time I showed up at the NAMM show, and I just put this thing on a table to talk to my friend Pat Wilson from Weezer, and he thought I wanted him to sign it. And so he went ahead and drove the little Weezer van and signed it, and I just left. I didn't say anything. I didn't really want you to sign it. I was just trying to say hi. Anyway, Jeff Queen signed that as well. But that launched the practice pad obsession. And so going down the path of, like, even if I was overseas, like, there would be like some random pad that was sold in Australia that like was a flap of rubber that you put on a coffee table, I would buy it. All the Vic Firth pads I had, the Steve Gadd signature pad, even those old school, sometimes you see them in like revival drum shops, you know, the blocks of wood at an angle with just the rubber glued on. I don't even know if they were Ludwig pads or who made them, but I was just all about padding and how it made you react and play, like the sort of tactile biofeedback sensation given different types of pad surfaces. So I think that playing on one pad, like, let me put it this way, a practice pad that's just pure gum rubber, super bouncy, I don't think it does anything for you. I don't think there's anything on a drum set that resembles gum rubber, unless maybe you're practicing for your V-drum kit. Then that might make sense. But even a V-drum kit has a different feel, you know? But I think the reflex pad is good because of the two choices that you have in terms of what happens. Like, one's a floor tom, one's a snare drum, that kind of a thing. So
you've had lessons with Dave Elitch, and so have I. So from your perspective, someone who people come to you to get technique lessons and whatnot, what was your mindset going in talking to a peer like Dave, and what were the blind spots that he found in your playing? Because he found a lot of mine.
I could tell you work with Dave because you're using the term blind spot. I don't know if that was a Dave original or if he heard it from somebody else. We all have them, obviously. I went into Dave. He and I think he started commenting on some of the stuff I was doing, and I, you know, was made well aware that he was teaching a lot of professional players out there. And I was like, well, hell, I'm in LA. I'll schedule a lesson with Dave. I've sat down with people all over the world just because I've reached out and they made themselves available. Like, if I go to Germany, I'm going to sit down with Benny Greb. If I go to New York, I'm going to sit down with whoever I can find, you know, in New York at the time or LA. And a lot of it is just to get with my peers and to sit down and have them play and just watch them and get the feedback at the same time. And Dave, I think with every lesson I've ever taken from a professional, with the exception of John Fisher and Stephen McWhorter, who's the current world champion Scottish drummer, every drum set player I've sat down with has been really great at acknowledging the blind spots that I already know that I have. Like Dave, I could have scripted what Dave was going to tell me because I knew I was already doing it wrong. And that's not to discount what Dave can observe and say. The way he put things for me in terms of posture and like making suggestions were great. But it was good to hear from him, like the affirmation, like, that's what I was thinking. So glad you agree. Got it. Like, I know what I need to do. And of course I need to do more work. I mean, Dave can play circles around me, and, you know, there's things that I can do that he can't do, and vice versa. We have that mutual respect. And so to bring it back to your question of like when people come to me, I think that I'm always very careful whenever a student comes to me, professional or beginner or intermediate player. I'm looking at every person that comes in the door, male or female, kid, adult, whatever, that my job as a teacher is to make sure that within the hour or hour and a half or whatever scheduled, that they leave inspired and not discouraged in any way. So I'm never going to take down or tear down anybody's technique on lesson 1, or lesson 2 or lesson 3 or whatever. It's about embracing what they've learned and not discounting the amount of time that someone has put in. But then sort of like, you can lead a horse to water thing, but you can't make him drink. We study and work long enough around the edges so that we get to the place where the students or the players realize that there is that blind spot, or there's a need, or there's maybe a maximum speed, or they can only play so low in terms of dynamics. And then I open the door to like, well, here's this thing called sound levels. Here's this thing called stick heights or whatever. So much like Dave and his talk about posture and being able to create, an even flow in your body, like the same thing happens by understanding what it is that obstructs our hands and our feet. And look, I also know, and from touring, that like we may be able to sit in a practice space and free up those pathways and feel and play great. And as soon as you get on the expressway or whatever, you get in a pack train or you get on a stage, you fly, you don't sleep, you have jet lag. It's a whole new set of parameters. Everybody knows that. And a lot of the students who will come to me sometimes arrive at a point where they're just not, their blind spot is an unawareness of all those other factors. Like, why do I continue to feel this way in terms of playing? And so we just I ask a bunch of questions and we just break it down. And honestly, some of the deepest stuff that I work on technically, I don't put on anybody. I don't say, hey, check out what I'm doing this week, because maybe they're not there yet. That's not to put myself on some pedestal. It's just saying, like, when you show up, if you call me for a lesson, you have very much in mind what it is that's bothering you, what you want to work on, And so my job is to like hear you out, listen, give you my feedback, and that's what we work on. I don't set up and say, here's my curriculum. This is exactly what you need to do, steps 1 through 5 or whatever, and then you'll get to where you want to be. I don't have a set curriculum like that. It's a case by case, student by student scenario. And, in the case of like Michael Lerner, who was one of your guests recently, his whole education early on as a kid was like, how can we just be creative as a drummer behind the drum set? I'm not gonna open up a book. I'm not gonna give you Joe Morello's Master's Studies, even though I have it, or it's a great book. Or I'm not gonna give you the Scottish book that's all nutty in terms of rudiments. Let's just see if we can play a song and have fun. Because again, the goal is at the end of every lesson, or it should be not just a lesson, everybody's practice session, is how do you get up encouraged and inspired and not discouraged and feeling like, man, that was a waste of time. So, long-winded answer to your question about lessons, but
well, no, it's great. And Michael, I'll echo what Michael said in the show, which is some of the later lessons with you, which he feels were some of his most beneficial. He doesn't even remember being on the drum set. You guys would just dissect a new Queens of the Stone Age record and kind of talk about it in real time together and talk about what Dave was doing and kind of, just be creative together, just verbally. And so, and he was like, that was a sign of a great teacher. I mean, he has nothing but the best things to say about you. So
he's a great dude. Well, I'll bring up one other student, Chloe Saavedra. Are you aware of who she is?
No.
Chloe plays with Caroline Polachek right now. And
okay.
And I started Chloe and her sister when she was 5 years old. And they were two little kids that came into a music store where I was working, and their mom wanted to buy them a drum set. And the youngest one, Chloe, wanted to play drums, but her mom wanted both sisters, to have an experience. So it was the only time in my life I've taught two students at once for a number of years. And all we did was make compositions, like basically create double drum parts and, vibe together. And one day I found out her sister played piano. She sat down and she was singing. I was like, wow, okay, well, this is going to change. Why don't you play the drums and you play the piano, and we'll just start working on songs together. And I had no other stock other than like, let's just have fun for an hour. And Chloe has gone on to do incredibly well and is a monster drummer. And when you watch her play, you see a lot of things that are not typical of drum. I mean, she plays open-handed. The way she sets up her kit is not a typical drum set. And I think it's not like I'm taking credit, but I will say that early on, there wasn't rules, there wasn't curriculum, there wasn't guidelines. It wasn't like, you need to do this, or you need to do this, or you need to read music, or whatever. But my encouragement with all my students, like I said, young or old, has always been to just be super creative and free. Like, be an individual. Like, there was a time, I think, when drummers were trying to copy everything that came out on a DCI video or a DVD, and they just wanted to play the Steve Gadd Mozambique, or they wanted to play the Dave Weckl Songo, or whatever. And one of the coolest videos at the time that came out when I was working in music stores was Brains shredding reppies on the Narnar Rad, because it was so different. It was such a breath of fresh air. So I think that not to disregard any of our any of the players that came before us, but in this day and age, man, you seriously have to be an individual. You got to be yourself.
When did you realize that you look at the instrument in a little more of an abstract way? And there's specifically there's a basic kind of demonstration you did where you just talk about how simple little things on your left foot can create these rhythms that you really don't even realize, or you don't think about with your hands. So yeah, when did you realize you think about things a little more abstractly, or do you even agree with that?
No, I do. I think from the time I was, when I got my first drum set, I was 14 and didn't have lessons, and it was just a creative time to explore the instrument. No one was, other than watching MTV, like just before MTV stopped showing videos. I don't know. I didn't know what I was doing, which is a good thing. I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I still don't exactly know what I'm doing. The first official drum teacher I had was Steve Smith, who owns and founded the Seattle Drum School. He was also, I think he taught Michael as well for a while. I could be wrong about that. And he taught Chloe, actually. But he was my teacher from the time I was 19 to 20. And then, like, for a full year, I was driving 100 miles once a week to go take a lesson with him. And then I moved down to Seattle when I was 19, but we'll save that for another story. Basically, he gave me a whole bunch of exercises that involved a lot of independence. And a lot of independence meaning like all four limbs doing something different at the same time. So my left foot was working like every time I went down there for a lesson, and it was playing not just quarter notes, but dotted eighths and open and closed. And then I started to mirror patterns. So whatever I did with the right foot with the bass drum, boom, boom, ka, was chick, chick, ka, boom, boom, ka, chick, chick, ka, with the left foot. And it just worked into my playing at that time through the curriculum that he was developing, which today is like a 250 or 280 page book of exercises. I think it's called Keys to the City. And if anyone wants to do the deep dive in independence, without those exercises, I would not have the left foot. I don't think I would have the left foot imagination that I have these days. But I also blame my left foot exploration on a pair of 1960s Zildjian A's, 15-inch, that were super light and super fast and articulate. They weren't a heavy, chunky cymbal at all. So whatever I did, like whatever kind of pressure there was, like just a little bit of heel lift, or getting up on the ball of my foot, the kind of hi-hats that would change in pitch, that thing. And so they were really like playful and interesting to find like these different textures in how I actually held my left foot on the pedal, let alone using it like for foot chicks and heel splashes.
All right, so I did want to I want to play a song from your past, and this actually is a song that I played in Michael's episode, but we just played the beginning of it. And while we did kind of focus on the beginning of the song in the episode, I did want to play now the ending of it when you kind of open up, and it's the song Subterfuge by Neo from the album Space Country back in 2001. And I want to play from about 2:30 on, maybe like 40 seconds of it, because you do this cool thing, and I might butcher kind of the explanation of it, but the songs at that point of the song is kind of in 5/4, and you're doing kind of a dotted quarter note or a quarter note triplet thing over it, and then that quarter note triplet on the ride cymbal becomes the new downbeat, the new quarter note, and it's a really cool metric modulation thing, and it will lead me to my next question, but I just want to play that, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, that metric modulation was definitely my fault. Actually, that idea came from me. There are so many pieces of my history, musical history, that have been documented that Death Cab fans would have no idea, I think, that it's me, because it's so out and nothing but odd times and angular and anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's you've been quoted saying, and thank God that I found Death Cab, because that came along at a time when I maybe was going a little bit too left and needed to be brought back to the center. So my question with that is, where do you think you'd be stylistically and creatively without the constraints? And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I think you know what I mean, the constraints of Death Cab.
I mean, I've always straddled that line between, hanging out with the trench coats of the smoke hole nerds like D&D kids and the varsity basketball players. Like I'm just saying, like I don't have allegiance to musos over like singer songwriter. Like we're gonna do this is boots and pants, kick and snare 1 and 3. Like I find a ton of pleasure in that, as long as I get to do some sort of layer that's underneath that like might have a little metric modulation. That being said, I'm very happy to play a kick drum 4 on the floor and a hi-hat on quarters, and that's it. Like if that's what works for the song, great. At the time that I joined Death Cab, the reason I said thank God I found Death Cab is because we are all passionate about riding these waves of inspiration where we go down the rabbit holes of who, name X player, whoever you chase in our development, in a drummer's development. Like if you're doing it right. Well, take that back. That sounds wrong. There are players that like only listen to Neil Peart and that's all they do. And they get that band and they're in that band and they make a career out of it. Great. And there are, players that only listen to Ringo or only listen to Al Foster or Gadsden, and they just sit in a groove pocket and they make a career out of it. That's great. But when we get to the list of talking about different players that have influenced me, those big markers, I've always been that way. I am as drawn to Elvin Jones and as I am Buddy Rich, and those are two entirely different players, and I'm I think the first song I ever learned top to bottom was Master of Puppets. And yet the very first cassette tape that my grandparents gave me was Buddy Rich Time Check. And couldn't get further apart, really. So I think if I had never joined Death Cab, I would still be teaching at the Statler Drum School full time. And I would probably just be playing with whatever random bands around town that I could work with. And because I didn't join Death Cab until I was 28. And there were 2 separate occasions they asked me to play in the band, and I said no, because I was still playing in bands like you just played, where it was musically exciting, but there wasn't a lot of opportunities to go out and tour. And I mean, unless you were in Chicago and you were on some post-rock circuit, and there was a lot of clubs that you're booking or that were booking your band. I had a good thing going with teaching, and for almost 10 years, pretty solid, and or 9 years maybe. And I just didn't want to jump in a van and try and go for it with an angular, challenging, oddball music project. So, in joining Death Cab, what it did for me was it made me strip away. It made me leave all the books and the DVDs and the metric modulation and all the challenging muso drumming stuff. I put it in the closet. I put it in boxes, and then I just started listening to songs and lyrics and how I could frame my drum parts in a way that highlighted all those things. And I realized that was a much more universal approach to the world of music that I hadn't really considered until then. And I learned, I learned a lot from teachers and books and videos, and then I learned a lot from being in a band and how to be supportive in a much different way. So, I mean, I know it's been said many times in your interviews about, people realizing what it's like to be in a supportive role. But that's what I meant when I said it's a good thing I met the band, because they really, funny story, and people could find it, is I showed up for the first Death Cab practice with charts. Like, I had written everything down of not just the songs I wanted to play, but other songs, all written. I still have the notation. And I played off of the music stand, and like 2 songs in, I think Ben said, "Okay, clearly you know the music, so let's just put it away and just play." And I was like, lesson 1. I mean, with the band and moving forward in my, whatever, second or third active study, as I will call it. Like, this is the band. And it's funny too, because they wanted, I think initially they were questioning like whether I was dragging or rushing in terms of time. And I wasn't, because I'd been playing to a clique with students all day long for 10 years. What they were doing was dragging and rushing, and they were used to being on tour. And so whenever they got to the loud section, it leaned, and whenever they played quiet, it was like everybody was laying back. And so they thought I was rushing when they were laying back. So it took a little while for us to like figure out how to like abide by each other's like internal pulses. So that, again, just a huge lesson. You can't get that from books or DVDs or practicing with whatever independence, crazy, New Breed, Gary, all that shit it's crazy and great. It's expanding, but like, is it applicable in a band? Don't know until you sit down and try.
Absolutely. Well, let's just get into your top 5. I do have a few more questions, but I want to maybe sprinkle them in, but let you kind of lead the conversation. So if you have the list in front of you, you can, because I know some of the times I try and pronounce some of these words and I just butcher it. So if you want to introduce them, then we can go from there.
Was number 1 Talk Laughing Stock Ascension Day?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the band?
No, and that's why I was actually looking at your list.
Dude.
I'm not familiar with 3 of them, but 2 of them I am.
I started playing music with people like out when I was 15, and I somehow got an opportunity to be like the guy in an open mic band. And obviously everyone was 21. I was not. I tried to wear like a turtleneck and act old and like not shave a very wispy mustache. But anyway, I got to play with some people who were, 7 or 8 years older than me. And one of them was this amazing jazz pianist named Bill McDonough, who still lives here in Bellingham, where I'm at now. And I was at his house one day, and he's like, "Have you ever heard this band?" And it was 1991, and he played Talk for me. And it was Laughing Stock, and the first track he played was Ascension Day. And what you're going to listen to is this song, and it's in 7, but what was so weird about it is that the way it was divided and played it didn't sound like 7, it sounded like something more even, like, because the snare drum hits on 3 and the and of 6, so it's evenly played. Everything's 3.5 beats apart, like the kick and the snare. And I don't know, it was also like, it was also kind of terrifying. It had this really messy, bloody sounding production. And it was just like people in a room. It wasn't anything like, say, the pop radio that I grew up with, like Hall & Oates. And I mean, that was the stuff my parents were listening to, and I was just a little kid. But when I first started to put an ear on like Michael Jackson and Hall & Oates and Madonna and stuff like that, it was such, signature Prince. It was such a signature production that this was like a radical change. And I don't know I think it might have been the first time I heard a drummer with a snare drum that rang quite as much as Lee Harris, who's the drummer in this song.
Yeah, I'm usually good at picking out 7, but I was trying to find the one on that. That's a tough little bugger.
It's a weird one. And again, it was like the first time I heard a piece of music that was really broken and wrong. Like it wasn't in tune. It was just very challenging production. And maybe it was time and place because, I mean, think about everything else that was happening in 1991. And then I started to dig deeper and find out who Tok Tok was and where they came from and the pop hits that they were responsible for, to the level of a band like No Doubt covering some of their biggest hits. Like they came from a really different place. And I feel like that was when they just went off the deep end and said, fuck it to all industry guidelines. And that definitely punted me into the netherworld of more avant-garde music. And before that, I was learning Steve Gadd, grooves. I was playing Late in the Evening and 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover with cover bands and Josie and Black Cow. And anyway, it was and at the same time, I was listening to what, everyone else in high school was listening to, like the Pixies and Nirvana and Pearl Jam and all the other big records of the time. But that was like, I don't know what it was about that sound and the way it was recorded that it was very much has been my Desert Island record for a long time. And there's only 6 tracks on the album and 3 of them have drums and 3 of them don't. It's very weird.
You said Lee Harris is
Lee
the drummer's
Harris
name?
is his name, yeah. And he went on to do, I don't know much else other than this band called Orang. But Mark Hollis, who's no longer with us, was the singer and songwriter in that band. And the producer they worked with was Phil Brown. And he was all about like placing mics, like in one spot and then moving the band around the mic to different distances so that it could have the right perspective and depth of field for the recording itself. And again, that was just my high fidelity moment of like getting super nerdy about recording and thinking about music differently. It was also the dawn of my wanting to record myself. So I started to take more of an interest in engineering, and by any means that I could. So whenever there was a unique sounding album out there that seemed obtainable in terms of production, I would sort of chase that vibe. But there's 2 tracks on that album specifically. It's Ascension Day and After the Flood that are super hypnotic. They almost sound like samples, but they're not, to my knowledge. And that is, as much as my drum sound is different than that these days, it was, like I said, a big eye-opener for me. Lee Harris is a huge inspiration.
Well, we can go on to number 2, and it's Can, and this is, again, case in point why it shouldn't be pronounced. Is it Tago Mago?
Sure. Tego Mago, Tago Mago. I'm not sure because I wasn't there when they made it, but...
Sure. And the song is Mushroom, and this is from 1971, so 20 years before Ascension Day came out.
Jackie Liebzeit was, man, talk about a signature sound. I think he was so far ahead of his time. The whole band and the stories of Can, like all living in a castle and recording music together. I mean, it's not new news now. At the time I was introduced to Can, I was 19, had just moved down to Seattle, was working at a music store, started to advertise that I was teaching now at the Seattle Drum School, because after almost a year, they just asked me if I was interested in teaching there because I was knowledgeable of the curriculum. So I said, sure. So I think the very first student I had was the drummer from a Pacific Northwest band called Sage, which you can still find their music out there, but they were in the sort of early 90s to mid 90s. And the drummer, Mike Williamson, I don't know, we just got to talking in the drum shop, and he found out that I was teaching, and he said, I'll take a lesson. And we became good friends. And early on, he made me a mixed CD. And this song was on there, Mushroom by Can. And once again, I was very much drawn. I mean, the feel of this track is sick, but I was really drawn to the production, and I was obsessed with how he got his cymbals to crash, which with such short decay. And I wanted to do a deep dive on, because for me, the sound of a kit, the production of a drum set it's like 50% of the feel. It is a huge part of the way things come across, as evidenced by our favorite big fat snare drum, and the ability to put something on top of your drum, and all of a sudden your whole feel changes. Like everything changes just by adding one thing and changing the character. It makes you play different. So this track, Mushroom, just had a ton of swagger and vibe to it. And the drummer, Jackie Liebzeit, also rest in peace, he just crushes it. Every time I hear it, Iggy Bomb Yossi is probably my favorite Can album as a whole. Mm-hmm. But this track was where it all started for me.
Sweet. Here you go. Mushroom.
Yeah, that I mean, like when you listen to it in headphones, it's like you're in a castle or something. You can hear like the close mics on the left, and then the microphone that's down the hall, like way over to the right, and just the whole separation, and everything. Again, without that, if it was just all up the middle, it wouldn't. I mean, the groove would still be great, but again, it's the presentation. It's the signature sound of him as a drummer, or any instrumentalist. Like, if you have a sound that's recognized like immediately versus being more of a chameleon, I just think that you stand a way better chance of having a career.
1,000%. And that's the hardest thing, which is kind of why I don't think I've found that yet for myself at my ripe old age of 34. And I think that's why I enjoy this format of the podcast, because I found so many bands I've never heard of just because I talked to elite drummers and they send me down these rabbit holes. And then there's been a few times on this tour where certain things have crept into my playing subconsciously, and I'm like, oh, sweet, I'm getting closer to finding something that I pulled from this guy that made it my own that I would have never heard of if I hadn't talked to Richard Spavin, you know? So it's selfishly, this podcast is about me, but then other people get to listen to it and enjoy it as well.
Spavin has an incredible approach. His phrasing is just unlike any other. He's probably the freshest player I've heard in terms of approach in a really long time.
I'm curious. I wish I could talk to him. The drummer of this track, what's his name again for Can?
Oh, Jackie Liebzeit. I have his book over here. Hold on, let's look at it. He wrote this crazy book that came out recently called, his last name is Liebezeit. It's his life, theory, and practice of a master drummer, and it's super heady. It's a lot of math. He invented his own rhythmic language, like his own notation, and talks about his evolution, and towards the end, like, he didn't believe in playing kick drums. So he took bass drums out of his drum set and he's like, for centuries, people haven't played bass drums, right? They've just used their hands. So why can't I just have a floor tom with a mute on it and just use that as my kick drum? But that whole band, that whole vibe, so cool. And quick back, like, at the time that I was presented Can, the records were out of print. So the fact that, you know, my CD rip was a recording off of vinyl that was out of print meant even more that it was like pure gold, and that I really needed to investigate.
I would love to talk to him and ask him in that song specifically, did he hear that effect during playback? I'm assuming not. I'm not sure if the technology back then would be able, but I'd like to hear that song, that beat dry, and what he was hearing when he played it, knowing that, oh, this is going to get in this direction after we run it through some stuff. But that'd be...
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of beautiful recordings are happy accidents. I mean, like you and Michael talked about the super raspy floor tom head, you know, at the end of the track. And I could see the wrinkles in that head, right? When you guys were solo or listening to the end of it. I think that some of the best recordings are recordings that aren't obviously overthought in terms of performance, but also in terms of production. Like, people did the best they could with what they had at that time, and nothing got in their way. I mean, the way that my studio is set up at home, you can't see the whole thing, but there's 4 drum sets set up in here right now that all are a different feel and shape, and sort of, you know, one of them's big with 12 mics, another one's got more, it's a mono kit, much smaller sizes, all dried up, 4 channels. And then I've got this boiler room with a single pancake kit and a ribbon mic over it. And that sounds a lot like the Can track we just listened to, or like a weird Tom Waits recording. And then I also have an electronic kit a little bit further down the room. But at any time, the idea is that I come in and I sit down and I'm inspired, and I hit R and I start recording with no click, no tempo or anything. It's whatever I feel at that moment in time. And those things often turn into, you know, songs or loops that people want to use. And it was just a moment of inspiration. It was captured, not overthought so much. But I think that's something that a lot of people need to consider, is don't get all caught up in overthinking the process. Same thing goes for technique, man. If you're thinking about technique while you're working on technique or playing, it defeats the purpose of natural technique. You know, I mean, there's no way to tap into your real self if you're overthinking it.
Do you have a favorite record, meaning a song that has a specific mistake in it a moment that sometimes stands out to you that, oh, this guitar is so weird, or kind of like that Kinks song that Michael was talking about?
I don't know. It's debatable. I mean, people are going to attack me for this one, but I think that a lot of the playing on like John Coltrane's A Love Supreme is pretty damn loose, but it's the intent is so 1000% right and on. You know, like people, I remember Elvin, somebody asking Elvin at one point in time. I got to meet Elvin before he died, and such an incredible man. And I had heard that somebody asked him once, Elvin, sometimes you don't always come in on the one. Like, is that intentional? And he just laughed and he said, my one is wide. And that made such great sense to me. I was like, you're right, man. Like it should be wide. Like, imagine preparing every word that came out of your mouth to have the exact same, imagine if storytelling was one dynamic and didn't change in terms of tone and inflection or anything. It would be boring, right? You'd be put to sleep. So I think I can't really put a finger on that Talk Laughing Stock record. There's one moment on After the Flood where it's almost like in the mix they forgot a fader was pushed up on the guitar track, and you're in this like hypnotic haze, and all of a sudden it gets super loud and you almost like want to like turn it down, but it's just this moment where it was a happy accident and they left it. And I think things like that are really important. I think computers have screwed us up in a big way in terms of like having the option to hit Apple Z or undo and edit everything, and we strip the humans out of the performance. So I'm trying to straddle a line between, contemporary tracking and editing and sending out drum stems for people that are also still providing very much the human being that's back behind the drums,
Mm-hmm. There's this song, Classical Gas, by Mason Williams with Jim Gordon on drums. And maybe it's about halfway through the song. I don't think that song was recorded to a click. It's very, very theatrical, the whole production.
Is that what I'm thinking of? Yeah.
And there's this part about halfway through where it just cuts out, the drums cut out, and kind of the horns kind of do a re-intro vamp before the drums come back in, and they speed up a little bit. And in the recording, you can hear he comes in, he's trying to pull them back, but he's also trying to respect the tempo they just introduced. So it's this weird, like it's on the 15 or something. And it's when I try and play along to it, I try and do that same feeling he had to create to hold everything together, and it's a challenge, but it's become a hook to me, even though in the recording it's a error in timing, but it's one of my favorite parts of that song. So I agree.
I love that, putting on the hat of another drummer or another, when you have to obey by those. I mean, the band was, Levon, and everything they did was just, you can't, those recordings wouldn't work if they were like completely gridded out, or I mean, there's so many songs. Again, this is how we convey our emotions, is by not restricting ourselves. Just go for it, just play. And I've sent tracks to people and they're like, and I've worked really hard to have them like really land and be perfect, and they don't want them. And they're like, can you do it looser? Looser the better. I've heard that T-Bone Burnett, famous producer, has like called off like tracking. They'll be like, we need to take a break because things begin to sound too locked in, too together. So I don't know, happy accidents, stick with them, right? They're intentional. Do it.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of not playing to a grid, number 3 is John Bonham, Led Zeppelin 4, song 4 Sticks, from the same year that actually that Can song came out, 1971.
Yeah, crazy, right?
Yeah, talk a little bit about that, and then I'll gladly play some John Bonham.
I was 14 years old and hanging out like classic, like scene with a friend whose 2 older brothers, 10 years older, were like under the hood of Mustangs, like working in a barn, like classic, like handkerchief and back pocket, like, and this was probably 1984 or something like that. Is that right? No, it would have been 1989 or something like that. I don't know how old I was. Anyway, they were playing Led Zeppelin in like total car mechanic style, like cranking through a shitty ghetto blaster. And Zeppelin came on, and I was like, who is this? Because I was still coming off of that, like listening to pop radio Hall & Oates at home because it was whatever my parents had on the radio, and there was so much attitude in Zeppelin. It was the first time I heard Zeppelin, and then I also couldn't count it. I couldn't tap my foot to it, and that drove me to investigate more and figure out why. And then I realized it was in 5, right? Yeah, 5/4 is the verses, and then it goes to 6 for the choruses. And then there was this weird clicky sound in the drum part on the toms, and then I read the title again. It was like 4 sticks. I wonder if he's actually holding 4 sticks. Of course he's holding 4 sticks. So then it drove me to want to investigate that whole catalog, and I think by the time I guess maybe it was 13 when I heard it, but for my next birthday, I asked for the whole Zeppelin catalog. That's all I wanted for my birthday, was every album that they put out. So I got 10 all the way through Coda, and just did a deep dive on Zeppelin. But it was 4 sticks, not Black Dog or Stairway to Heaven or what you'd think. That was the first track that I heard. And again, just his approach, man. Signature sound, undeniable, but so cool when a drummer can be let off the chain and play in an odd time and make it groove. So that's what this track did for me.
All right, here is 4 sticks after I do a cute little fade in. We're talking about household names, right? But I really loved how Bonham could do anything, but chose to do the right things. And I love how when it came to making an odd time sound right, like the ocean or something that wasn't a standard 4/4, you didn't realize it as a listener, right? You didn't question it. You can play odd times really odd, just like you can play 4/4 super angular and weird. But I've always loved and how Vinnie Colaiuta is a great example when he played on that Sting 10 Summoner's Tales and playing in 7, and you didn't think about it because there might have been a common pulse that went through that was making you think that it wasn't odd. So Matt Cameron was another guy, and of course he's on my list here, but who would play odd times and have them feel not odd. So yeah, Bonham for sure. The whole catalog, the whole sound, the whole vibe. And I'm only talking about drummers from a ways back, and that's not to say that I'm not inspired by, someone who's in a band for the first time today, who's 20 years younger than me. I definitely have those inspirations coming at me from all directions, but as we're talking about these big 5, we're talking about those building blocks that help, decide how I sounded and who I became as a player. And John Bonham was definitely one of them. And he even this is a very popular song by Led Zeppelin, but Kashmir, he held down a weird time signature just by holding it down. I don't even know what Kashmir would be in. It's 4/4 because you hear the drum beat, but that guitar part's doing some weird looping thing, but he makes it feel groovy because he knows when to step out of the way.
Yep. He's just an anchor, I think that's what any odd phrasing needs, is it needs an anchor.
All right, so let's go to number 4, which is Soundgarden, speaking of Matt Cameron. And Bad Motorfinger is the album, and Jesus Christ Pose is the song. Again, same year as Talk Talk, so 1991.
Matt's a buddy. Matt, I've just come to know Matt from living in Seattle, being around Seattle, and he's such a solid rock drummer and human being, and talk about having a signature sound and an approach to drumming. I mean, I could almost say where I was every time I heard a Soundgarden song come on, whether it was early on Loud Love, Screamin' Life, or Ultra Mega OK, or Bad Motorfinger, or, I remember specifically where I was after a Soundgarden drought, in terms of like they hadn't released an album in a while, where I was literally in the car getting on the West Seattle freeway when Spoonman came on the radio, and I was like, what a fucking sound, just this wall of drum sound. And that Keplinger snare drum, Greg Keplinger is a good friend. But all this was attainable because Matt was local, like I grew up 100 miles north of Seattle, but as a kid, with everything that was happening in Seattle in the 90s, the whole music explosion, as a young drummer, the coolest thing about Seattle was like, it's right there. You could do that. Like, you could be in a band and just drive down the road, or you can get shows in Seattle. You might actually still see these musicians come through drum shops. And that was the case when I was 19 and first started working at a music store in Seattle. Like, Dave Grohl would come in and sit down and play drums. And it just seemed possible. It was like, it was okay to dream. It wasn't unobtainable. It wasn't like you were standing on the other side of the river for something, of something that you couldn't get to because you didn't have a boat. Most of the Seattle musicians were really approachable, still just walking around town. And Matt Cameron was somebody that was approachable in that way. And I got to know him much better as time went on, because my wife worked for Pearl Jam for almost 10 years. And so I got to see him a lot more regularly at shows, and watching him evolve and navigate both of those bands was he's a real mentor in that way. But I've always been a fan of his playing and his phrasing and, his choices for fills. And just, I think it seems like the furthest thing from Matt's like initial instinct is backbeat. He doesn't just want to play a backbeat. He wants it to be a whole different feeling and sensation. So Jesus Christ Pose just really lent itself to being just that for me. Like, what a radical approach to playing the drums. Like, basically filling through the whole song, Yeah. In a super tough way, but you should play it.
Yeah, here you go. Those snare hits are so consistent too.
It's funny because Greg Keplinger teched for him for a long time. I would always pick his brain about Matt and his playing, and you literally he hits the snare drum in the same spot every single time. He's got one of those like 2-inch size wear marks on a snare drum head, and it's between center and the top. Like, a lot of the time he didn't rim shot. It was just like a slightly off-center hit. So it had that sort of hard attack impact of a rim shot. But I don't know what he's doing right now. I think he's probably doing whatever feels good. But back in that era, at that time when Greg was teching for him, he would tell me stories about how you would stand next to Matt, and it was just like, as Greg would say, with big eyes, it's just a fucking wall of sound. Like, he somehow just got a massive sound out of the drums, and always super solid. And yeah, as a rock drummer, as far as rock drummers go, like in terms of an influence, for me, Matt was probably number one rock drummer that influenced me at a time when I was very looking for kind of a path in terms of how to play. And it's funny too that when we talk about these records, like two of them are from two are from 1970.
Two are from 71, two are from 91. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that funny? 20-year spreads there. But those are look, the list of musical influences as far as drummers goes. I mean, you're wearing the hat. You're wearing the I mean, there are so many. It's impossible to. My top 5 might change next month. Matt Chamberlain is another good friend and a huge influence. Brian Blade, Steve Gadd for sure. Vinny, a friend and an influence. Jeff Tane Watts. I mean, from Brentford Marsalis era, there's so many drummers that have influenced me. Or really, Pete Erskine. I mean, anyone that has ever been in the pages of the classic modern drummer, there were posters on my wall. Jeff Porcaro. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. And I've gravitated towards, like I said, drummers that have a real signature sound. But I'm the next track we're going to play is evidence of where I'm headed musically, in terms of after studying all these drummers and their notes and their approach.
Well, let's just do it. So, John Hopkins, the album Immunity, and the song is Abandoned Window. And that's from, as you implied, a little more recent, 2014. Is this a drumless track?
Yep.
That's awesome.
Has anyone brought a drumless track in yet?
No, you are the first, my man.
So look, here's my point. This is why I wanted to do this. We're listening to ourselves way too much. And majority of the students who come to me their blind spot is what they can't see, which is what they're thinking about that they don't need to think about, if that makes any sense. We all have everything we need to be able to communicate with other musicians. And the more we overthink that, and the more we go down the path of investigation, the more we search and hunt for content that makes us better players, the more we're forgetting to listen to music. The more we're covering up what's there that's beautiful and needs to be heard. And I spent, John Hopkins is an electronic musician. If you follow his catalog, there's some really crazy early on, Oddvant electronic music that doesn't follow a grid at all. It's super feely and weird. But over the course of his career, he has, I would say, played less and less to present a truly distilled emotional catharsis musically. And basically what I'm saying is as much as it comes in cycles, 2 weeks ago, I was all about playing a dotted eighth pattern with the bass drum while playing paradiddles and singing each hand individually. And that's what I was working on, and the dynamics of that. Cool. But when I listen to that track, it arrests me in a way that my shoulders drop. Any stress that I have drops. It brings me to a relaxed state, a meditative state that allows for a much more open mind to creativity, to like real, to approach to sound on the drums in the same way that you can hit you can hit drums. Well, some would argue it. Some would say, Phil Collins would say, if the drums didn't sound good, I just hit them harder. So, which is cool until you can't walk anymore, because I'm not saying anything bad. Phil's amazing, but like, you could do damage to your body. And Dave Elich would agree 100%.
You're among friends. I agree. Yep.
But you can do damage to your hands. You could do damage to your feet. You could do damage to your brain just by thinking that you're not good enough, or thinking that you don't have enough at your disposal, whether it's technique or independence, or, your catalog or library of content or grooves that you can play. You may think that you're not adequate in any of those ways. And my favorite Death Cab tracks, or anything that I've done recently, has been more about listening to what the song needs and then bringing something to the table. And maybe that's nothing. But there was a time when I felt like I needed to have a real signature groove on everything that I was a part of. And more, I'm just celebrating what I've been able to do, what I still will be playing, and relaxing in terms of like knowing that I don't need to play every single note all the time, that I could not play, and maybe the song is more powerful because of it. So I am, much like that Talk record, the first one we talked about, 3 of those tracks on that album there's no drums on there. So I really encourage anyone who's trying hard to practice and really become the best drummer they can be. I encourage them to remember that part of that journey is to not play and to just listen. You also might find that when you do come back to the drums to play, you're more inspired. They sound better to you. They feel better. You're like, my kick drum sounds so good when I hit it once. Versus being buried in a barrage of notes and a barrage of overthinking and thought the whole thing. So that last track was just meant to be a cleanse in a way, like of reminding you that we're not the only ones that need to be heard. If anything, we should be more felt than heard. So that's why I wanted to end that way. But I love it. And I will say, I think, when it comes to being a singular player, I think you have definitely achieved that, if I haven't already said that to you. Obviously, you've never been a distracting drummer, but you do just enough that people know, oh, there he is. That's Jason. Oh man, thank you. Well, I still looking to climb.
Sure.
still want to get up there. But I think you're doing a really good job of not just talking to people who've made it, but people who still have a lot further to go, because their impression of the music industry and the journey in general is really valuable to us jaded old fucks who've been doing it for a while. But I will say that my journey is, it is for anyone that thinks that I'm there, or I've arrived, or I'm whatever. There's a mini Rushmore somewhere with a Jason McGerr profile on it. Like, man, I never wake up thinking that at all. I have never felt like I am done investigating or searching, and that goes as much for technique as it does for independence, as it does for production and recording and timekeeping. Right now I'm thinking, like, who can I go study with? Who's the best timekeeper you've ever heard? Do you have an answer for me on that one? Who's the best at keeping time?
Benny Greb is, that guy feels amazing always.
Well, maybe I'll call Benny after this and be like, dude, apparently I need to do some more work with you. Yeah. Last time I saw Benny in Germany, all we did was play drums side by side, and he really, everything he said to me that day was helping me get out of my head. It was just one of those rough patches of tour, which we've all been in, where it's like, man, I suck, or, I don't have my tour muscles yet. And Benny made some great suggestions, but yeah, watching the headspace that he gets into when he's performing is wonderful. And his book is excellent if you haven't read it yet.
I have. I pre-ordered it and waited like 3 months for it. Yeah, I was one of the first people. The first time he mentioned it, I was like, done, bought it. Because yeah, learning how to practice is really tough for me.
Practice takes practice.
Talks about. Yeah, well, he talks about it in his book, but just like if you were to record me on practice, they'd be like, okay, I'm playing something, I'm going, okay, you're going in a direction, and then it's just silence where I'm on Instagram for 20 minutes. It's not good. But speaking of teaching, and then we can end with this, and maybe I might put this further in because I might want to end on what we just discussed. But have you, talking about singular playing, have you ever had a student come in that is not hurting themselves, because obviously I should put a disclaimer there. They're not doing something that will eventually hurt themselves, but you don't even want to touch it because they have such a unique voice that you're like, let's just work on the other stuff?
Yeah, of course. It's the whole, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like for instance, like I've had students come in that their balance point on the drumstick is like way too high or way too low. And so in terms of natural rebound, the sticks are doing their own thing, and it's maybe sped up or it's slowed down or it's uneven, like have you ever considered playing a groove with one stick down low and the other one way up high? Like try playing a groove on one instrument, so just a snare drum or just a hi-hat with those two sounds. You can't replace that feel any other way. You have to hold the sticks that way, so it'll have a thing, and like I'd mentioned before, if you keep good time with bad technique, go for it. Like as long as it doesn't hurt you. But the only reason I will make a suggestion to hold a stick differently or turn your wrist or consider your fulcrum or anything is if what someone is trying to achieve is a different direction. So other than that, there was a time when Chamberlain, like the stick, when he was playing match grip, that the butt end of the stick disappeared, or it was barely there at all, and he had this big callus on his wrist. I don't know if it's still there on his hand, but these are just your means, right? So whatever you need to do to get your point across, and especially if it feels right and it has intent. Again, I'm not going to tear it down. I'll say this. One of my students, I've told this story before, I think, but back when I was at the drum school, William Goldsmith, you know who William is? Played with Sunny Day Real Estate.
Oh, yeah.
He came in for a lesson, and he was with me for a little while, and we did a bunch of independence and singing exercises, but he'd probably kill me every time I tell this story, but I remember him. Have you heard this? His first lesson?
Mm-mm.
He came in and he's like, oh, I'm so nervous and I don't know what to do. And I'm like, dude, you're William Goldsmith. Like, you're amazing. You're a killer fucking player. I don't know why you're here. Like, I have no idea why you're here. And I think he came because he was having a lot of tension. So he was worried about his hands and he didn't want to wind up in a position where he couldn't play. But I think I literally like a bridge jumping situation. I had to talk him off the ledge of just playing for me. Like, he didn't want to play. He was so nervous about it. And it wasn't because of who I was. It was maybe just in his character. And after several minutes of just trying to warm him up and talking through, I was like, I just need you to play something so I can see your hands and your feet. I just want to get an idea of, because I don't think at the time I'd seen Sunny Day up close. So, I mean, I had the records, but anyway, finally, William played, and I think he comes right in, and within the first beat or two, he broke the bass drum head on the kit. Just smashed right through it, and he was like, oh! And he stopped, and he was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I was like, dude, that is amazing. That is incredible that you have that much power. Because at the time, I mean, William was, maybe 5'8" and 150 pounds or something like that, and I'm 6'2" and 205, and I can't do that. I don't have that kind of Bruce Lee energy. And I was trying to congratulate him. I was like, that's the coolest fucking thing I've ever seen. The fact that you could just do that. And I think that kind of thing is worth preserving. I mean, sure, you could tweak and adjust the threshold and the parameters so that you don't break bass drum heads, and the bass drum head was probably loose, but I mean, that was the closest thing to Bruce Lee 1-inch punch that I'd ever seen. And that's a great example of something that when someone comes in with a thing that they maybe want to work on, I don't want to work on. I don't want to change anything about that. So, and still to this day, and William's killing it. And I don't have that kind of energy and power and rock that he has. And that's exactly what Dave Grohl, gravitated towards when he started his first band outside of Nirvana. So, yeah, to answer your question, there are some things that you just shouldn't touch, shouldn't mess with. And maybe that's, somebody's powerful hands and feet. Maybe that's Elvin Jones' posture. Who knows, right? Like, if you tried to change anything, like I heard that, Usain Bolt has scoliosis, and they tried to change his running style or take care of him, and it made him slower. So if you watch him take off from the line, he's got this kind of gait thing, and then he picks up speed, and he's of course the fastest man in the world. So there are some things that we, should just leave alone. They are the vehicle in which we use to get to where we need to be.
And that's the show. Be sure to subscribe, and if you're listening on a platform that allows for ratings or reviews, do that. It helps more people find the show, which means the show will get better and bigger, and hopefully I'll have a chance to sell out one day. But you'd be an OG listener that could brag to all your friends. Anyways, also, why don't you go ahead and check out bigfatsnaredrum.com and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and all the socials. Just search for @BigFatSnareDrum and you will find it. This show is edited in part using Isotope RX8 audio editor. It's amazing, so go check that out at isotope.com. Bye.